Hey, I'm Maggie Shoddy, and this is my Module 9 case study. So first, let's start with a summary of the case. We have a few people here in this case. First, we have Richard Inman. He's in his first year as assistant principal, and he's worked hard to reach those hard-to-meet South Side kids. James is a student from the south side of town, just like where Mr. Inman was from. He's a muscular, tattooed, and he's looked to be the leader of the rough and tough group. And then we also have David. He's an honor student, a band standout, and an overall undisputed boy. Later on, the school police officer will come into play and the mothers of both of the boys. This takes place at Rocket Junior High School. It's a school of about 900 students, and it's a beautiful spring day. So, what happened? Well, as I stated before, Mr. Inman has worked hard to form relationships with boys from the south side of town. He's formed a very positive relationship with James and checks in on him very frequently. A teacher shared that she saw James and David exchanging something in the hallway. Both boys were called into Mr. Inman's office along with a school police officer. When searching David, the officer found brass knuckles, a prohibited weapon. We find out later that James had asked David to hold these for him for something that he had to take care of after school. Even so, both boys had to be taken to the youth detention facility to be charged. According to district policy, both boys would have to be expelled for no less than 45 days into the district's disciplinary action education program, which I'll refer to as DAEP. Mr. Inman filled out paperwork for James, but did not complete the paperwork for David, as he didn't feel David deserved to be expelled. James had been here before and would be fine, but Mr. Inman was afraid it would be detrimental to David's future. The director of the DAEP contacted Mr. Inman to fill out the paperwork for David or be written up himself. So next, let's talk about the legal and ethical issues involved here. First, legally, no weapons are allowed in school. The boys are breaking the law here, no matter whose weapon it was. Next, we know that the district has a zero tolerance policy for weapons, and when that is broken, the child should be expelled for no less than 45 days. Mr. Inman does not follow through with the district policy. He fills out paperwork for James, but does not fill out the paperwork for David. I believe Mr. Inman knows what is right, but it's hard because David has never been in trouble like this before. So here's where our ethical issue lies. So here's my synthesis of the situation. The assistant principal from Rocket Junior High School has not followed district policy after discovering a student has possession of a prohibited weapon at school. So next, let's look at the facts. First, the people. We have Mr. Richard Inman. He's in his first year as assistant principal. We have James. He's the rough and tough kind of guy from the south side of town and has been known to cause trouble. And then finally, we have David. David is an honor student and a very active student who Mr. Inman doesn't even really remember the last time that he spoke to, other than maybe a congratulations after a band concert. So this all takes place at Rocket Junior High School. It's a decent-sized school with about 900 students. I'm assuming it to be a pretty diverse population. So then they're in the program itself. As I said, I think it's a semi-diverse junior high school, and these are young adolescent boys involved. So now I think it's important to look at who is involved in the situation and if anyone else needs to be involved. So the stakeholders in this case are obviously Mr. Inman, James and David, the school officer, and then the parents of the boys. So while we hear about the higher up administration coming into play later on in the case, when they tell Mr. Inman he needs to follow through on the paperwork, I still have questions if they know the whole story. I think that everyone has been consulted that needs to be, but I also think a deeper conversation needs to be had between Mr. Inman and his administrators to understand really the whole situation. I find myself wondering if more information would be helpful to make a decision, and I believe it would. I would prefer to know the thoughts of the administration team and the Board of Education after they hear Mr. Inman's explanation of the situation. Are they willing to erase the expulsion? Another important piece would be a little more information about David. Do we really know all we need to know about him, or is there more information that would be beneficial? Was he really just in the wrong place and helping James out? Or is he more involved than we think? So moving on, what are some possible consequences that could be? I came up with 3 options that could happen in a situation like this. Option number 1, Mr. Inman could not fill out David's expulsion papers. If this were the route that he followed, I believe it would be followed with Mr. Inman being written up and reprimanded. As for the boys, James would still be expelled as his papers were already turned in, but David would not be expelled and he would return to school like normal. Option 2, I came up with would be that Mr. Inman does fill out David's expulsion papers. In this situation, I think David and James would obviously both be expelled. All actions have consequences. And finally, the third option would be to create just a whole new policy. Instead of going straight to being expelled on a first offense, maybe probation first, following with expulsion for the second and third offenses, so on. In this option, James would still be expelled as this was not his first offense, but David might be put on probation. So depending on the policy that was written, maybe you could put something like an in-school suspension or daily or weekly check-ins, or even having extracurricular activities being taken away for a set amount of time. So now let's weigh out these options. So looking at option number 1 first, the pros of this. First, David would not be expelled. I think this is exactly what Mr. Inman wants in the first place. Following this, Mr. Inman feels like he did the right thing by not writing David up. He truly thinks David is a good kid and was just caught up in the middle of it. On the other hand, the cons of this case, Mr. Inman does not follow district policy, and because of this, he gets written up. This would cause him to be reprimanded and possibly lose his job. So looking at option 2, we'll start with the positives. First, Mr. Inman would follow district policy and both boys would be written up. In this option, I believe that everyone realizes that rules don't bend and that actions have consequences. I think this is an important message that needs to be shared to everyone. The cons of this option, on the other hand, would be that both David and James are expelled, and Mr. Inman feels bad for writing up David, even if it was the right thing to do. So finally, option 3. The pros of this option would be that a new, fairer policy is written. In this policy, expulsion isn't the consequence for a first offense, like in David's case. So David might not be expelled, but just put on probation. And Mr. Inman would pride himself on being part of writing a new policy to put in place. On the other hand, it may seem like this policy was written just for this situation, and I think some people would have very negative thoughts towards this. In turn, I think this could also cause Mr. Inman to lose respect and trust from both administration and from parents. So finally, after weighing out the options, I believe that option 2 would be the best option to proceed with. In this option, the policy is followed and the right thing is done, ethically and legally. Mr. Inman writes up both boys. I think the Board of Education and the administration team would respect Mr. Inman's decision, and a message of being fair would be sent to all parents, students, and community. District policy is always followed and rules don't bend. Again, actions have consequences. So here's how I would implement my decision. First, Mr. Inman would need to fill out the paperwork for both boys. This is district policy, and doing this would be the legal and ethical thing to do. Second, I believe a meeting should be had with all of the administrators, superintendent, principals, assistant principals, etc. During this meeting, it's important to go over ethical behavior and remind everyone, especially Mr. Inman, that ethical behavior should be modeled in all relationships. So then after this meeting, I think Mr. Inman would really like to meet with the administration team and the Board of Education to discuss maybe writing a new policy. I think it's important that he advocates for legal and ethical decisions and actions, but something that can be put into place to avoid a situation happening like this again. Maybe it looks like a probation period for a first offense. Maybe it's in-school suspension, or maybe it's just limiting those extracurricular activities for a time period. But finally, I think it's important that there's a daily check-in with the boys. I believe that while both boys were written up and expelled, things could change down the road. I would check in with the boys daily and hope that David and James could both be back to school before the 45 days were up. And that's how I would handle this situation. Thanks.